So Carol, your expertise in water quality, you're monitoring CECs and involved with CECs here in North America. I would love to hear, how your perspective on CECs and even particularly PFAS, how big of a problem is it? And if there are any particular CECs that you're really focused on at, today.
Sure. So right now, PFAS is a pretty big problem because for us as water utilities, because the public concern and the regulations are advancing so much faster than the technology and the funding and the science. So we have regulations being driven by public outcry and not by science and not by technology. So what's happening is we have different states setting their own limits. They don't want to wait for the federal regulation, and they're not following that federal, in general, they're not following that federal process of cost benefit analysis, feasibility, treatability, and looking at all the occurrence data. They're looking at the occurrence data for a very limited subset and regulating a larger set. So that's a big challenge we're facing. Our regulated utility operates in 6 states, and all 6 states have different limits, and including neighboring states, which can be very difficult to explain to customers.
So that's really around PFAS. Curious, beyond PFAS, with other constituents of emerging concern, what are some of those that are really key for you here in North America? And just really curious, how are you seeing the difference, perhaps, with some of your international counterparts?
I think the next contaminant of emerging concern here in the U.S. is 1,4-dioxane. That's starting to be regulated in New York, and they're proposing a limit now in New Jersey. So that's going to be a challenge because it's coming out at the same time as PFAS, but is a completely different treatment technology. So for people to plan for long term when they don't know how many different treatment trains they're going to have to add is very complicated. In other parts of the world, Suez, PFAS is not a big concern, other than Australia. Australia is in a similar situation to the US in terms of the level of contamination and the level of concern. And I believe 1 or 2 European countries have started regulating it, but in general, they're following the World Health Organization limit, which is something like 400 parts per trillion compared to 10 to 13 here. There's a strong interest in Europe about microplastics, and really haven't seen that reflected so much here in the U.S. There's an academic concern maybe, but the regulators are not yet pushing for a limit on that, and it would be difficult for them to do so because there is no approved analysis method for them. It's not really defined. So in Europe, our research lab has developed a detection method and a monitoring method, but it's in-house, and so that's going to be a big issue going forward.
Yeah, I think the microplastics topic is really interesting, and I think certainly the public is more aware of the issue of microplastics, and it seems like there's a big growing interest, and it will be interesting to see how the public perception and sort of pool really shapes how the regulation is accelerated or influenced by that in the coming years. What do you think are some of the biggest gaps currently for utilities and sort of the industry as a whole around the treatment and management of CECs, generally speaking? Is it really driven by regulation and the science? Is it funding? Is it just scalability with treatment? Just be really curious, the gap that you see currently.
It's all of the above. A huge gap on all of them is that they're all still in use. PFOA and PFOS are voluntarily discontinued, but that doesn't mean people no longer have items with it in it. And other countries are still using them. So we have no way to prevent them from entering our water system, and yet we're expected to remove them. So that's a huge gap. The technology that's out there, granular activated carbon's been proven to be effective, but looking at the EPA limit of 70 parts per trillion, then when you have states setting it at 10 or 5 or 8, we don't know how long that media is going to last. When you have the funding is enormous. It's an enormous cost to treat. For say a large surface water treatment plant, we may need 130 pairs of GAC vessels to treat for PFAS. That's just astronomical. And when you look at how quickly these regulations are passing, for example, New York, they proposed the regulation and passed it, and it became effective in 1 year. That does not allow enough time to plan and design and pilot test and budget and all the things that we have to do. There are some really promising technologies out there that are being studied, but they're not scaled up yet. And it's unlikely that the regulators will accept them in most cases without extensive pilot treatments that the regulations don't allow time for. So it's a real catch-22 for us. We have customers demanding non-detect, and we don't have technology to even to measure to the levels that people are demanding. So it's a real gap in all of those areas.
Yeah. And to stick with the PFAS issue a bit more, we are certainly seeing a lot of the concern on the drinking water side, on treatment. And there is a growing conversation around how PFAS from a biosolids land application perspective is how we will manage and continue to track and manage that generally. Is Suez, or in your expertise, I mean, how is that discussion part of this, and how are you approaching that?
We're monitoring it because that is obviously a tremendous concern, particularly if PFAS is designated as a hazardous substance. That will help prevent it from getting in the water, but that will also make, when we remove it from the water, that will make our biosolids hazardous substance. So it's definitely something we're keeping an eye on. There's no approved method to test for it in biosolids and in wastewater. So we're using drinking water methods. And there's that, again, that gap where the regulators say they would use this information to track the polluters and stop them. But in the meantime, the wastewater facilities or the drinking water facilities with residuals are they're being held to the standard that the manufacturers are not being held to.
Mm. I imagine the governance of water and wastewater operations, if it's one utility versus multiple, that sort of governance and jurisdiction really could complicate, how this is managed in a particular region, let alone how that might differ across states. So definitely, I think that will continue to be a challenge. And it sounds like from what you're saying, it's really on the detection and analytical methods and the clarity around that. That's also really important for us as an industry to align on. I don't think we're there, and we have a long way to go. How are you continuing to sort of approach that balance of not necessarily having a lot of that that solidified, right? And you're having to respond to your constituents. How are you striking that balance between what is regulated, where you're heading, where you think the industry is heading, versus and all the other challenges that your organization as a water utility is needing to prioritize? How are you striking that balance?
It's not easy. We're trying to be proactive in a way that is not a way the water industry is used to being. We're used to having 6 or 8 or 12 years to prepare for a new major regulation, and when we started seeing that we weren't going to be given the courtesy of that kind of time frame, we started testing everywhere, even where there was no pending regulation, just to see. Many of our facilities were not regulated by the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. We had no baseline data, or even if we did have unregulated contaminant monitoring data, it was at that 20 part per trillion, 40 part per trillion limit. So we just developed, kind of a snapshot of where we are so we can identify risk. And same thing with wastewater. There's no pending regulations, but we just took a look with the drinking water methodology to see if we could have a potential risk. And it was not an easy sell. These samples cost about $500 each when you count the trip blank. So it was challenging, but it's important information to have.
I have sort of a question that's coming to mind, and I'm struggling on how to articulate this, so bear with me. Utilities are dealing generally with having to increase rates to be able to financially support the required infrastructure treatment, of today, right? Just so how is the value of water being assessed to be able to serve based on today's conditions, let alone the future, which can very much be shaped by how CECs are regulated and managed and what the requirements are. Um, what do you think the growing interest of the public around advanced treatment and, we're moving as an industry towards reuse, resource recovery, a lot of exciting advancements. How do you think that's going to really influence rates and the discussion around how we value water going forward?
That's a difficult conversation because the constituents, they have different needs, and for everyone who's demanding that every drop of PFAS come out of their water, every bit of microplastic, there's someone else who can barely afford their basic water bill. So to blanket, raise the rates across the board to remove PFAS to zero or whatever our detection limit is now,
Mhm.
it's not that easy. And of course, we would certainly want to remove as much as possible, but we have to balance that with all the other needs we have. There's a new lead and copper rule, there's aging infrastructure, there's so many other things we have to address with the same piggy bank. So it's and then again, with the speed of the regulations, it's difficult to plan into those rate cases what's coming down the line, because it comes so quickly. There's no way to get it into the budgets, and same thing for a municipality, really, to get it in that 5-year cycle.
Mm. Yeah, that's the reality. That's such an important point. Just knowing how water is so integral to our way of life, and there are just so many stakeholders with the water utility on these issues, like constituents of emerging concern, which the water utility is the receiver and manager of this resource, but certainly there are a lot of different parties that contribute and that are just a part of this process. What as a water utility professional, do you have any sort of asks or desires that you'd like to see our industry and other stakeholders? How could we come together around some of these challenges? Is it better communication with our government and leadership on the policy side? Is it education? Is it just more understanding of the science and more research? Just curious how you see us sort of coming together, knowing it's so integral to really sort of advancing the sector forward.
I think, just specific to PFAS again, but the EPA action plan had the right idea in a way that we have not traditionally done. It's to look at it holistically. This is where it's getting into the water. These products are contributing to it. It's ending up in the wastewater. When it gets in the wastewater, it ends up in the drinking water. And looking at all those things at the same time. That's, I think that's the way we have to look at it. But that takes time and that takes money. And there are a lot of forces pushing against one or more of those components. So, and we've seen that already with the states not being willing to wait for EPA to complete that action plan. But if the funding and research would help us a lot to that argument, to explain why we can't remove it to 1 part per trillion, or why we can't treat, put in treatment in a month, things like that. It's just, I don't think it's the public doesn't even understand that we're not putting these contaminants in the water, let alone why we're not taking them out. So, yeah, actually, everything you said, but a holistic view to me is the one thing that we've really kind of been lacking as an industry, and we're getting there with the one water and the reuse, but we're
Mhm.
not there yet.
Yeah, yeah, such a great point. So in regards to PFAS, I know we're sort of bouncing around here with just CCs and the topic of PFAS. It seems like the United States is really sort of taking the lead around PFAS regulation management, just the overall discussion. Would you agree with that? And then, again, going a bit more broadly, what are other what are other parts of the globe that you yourself, being an expert in this field, where are you looking to learn from your peers and what's happening in other parts of the world with other CECs?
It's interesting. In other parts of the world, they're not really they're CECs, but they're not. It's more the emerging concern part because they're not new. There's a lot of concern about manganese and aluminum
Mhm.
and contaminants that we consider aesthetic, because there have been potential health effects linked to them with Alzheimer's and some cognitive issues with manganese.
Mhm.
So they're keeping a very close eye on manganese and aluminum and actually setting internal limits within at least within Suez. We have internal limits for those, which is not, it doesn't seem to be on the radar at all here in the US. I know manganese is in the current unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, and they may be considering making it a primary contaminant, but it's got a much higher profile everywhere else in the world, which I thought was interesting. But other things like PFAS definitely is not considered a high priority in most of the rest of my company's service area.
Mhm.
And things like disinfection byproducts, it can be all over the place. What's allowable in Morocco is crazy compared to what might be allowed in France or here. So
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's a really exciting time for our industry as, technology continues to advance and there's more resources dedicated towards research and just understanding the problem and just the different leadership of organizations like Suez, just sort of setting your own internal limits and sort of trying to find that right balance of going above and beyond for your constituents while sort of anticipating what might be coming down the line. So, is there anything that you wanted to share or speak to around the topic of CCs and or PFAS that you think's really interesting, that you'd want to put out there for your peers and just other professionals that are really interested in this topic?
I think we as an industry need to get better about educating the public about these contaminants, because if we don't, someone else will. And we've all seen Environmental Working Group, they've they put it out there in a very simple way that people understand. And when you compare that to our consumer confidence reports, there's no comparison. We need to be better about explaining. They're going to research it on their own, so we need to be better about explaining what they are, what we're doing about them, what the consumer can do to prevent them from getting in the water. That is something that we just don't really get out there. So that would be what I would think, because right now we are seeing the public learning these things on their own, making their own assumptions at a much faster rate than in the past, and before we even get a chance to look at it. So I think we have to get ahead of that better.
Do you see any particular groups in the water industry taking that leadership role right now that you would want to see amplified, or do you really see that as a space that we are just not tackling as aggressively as we should? You don't really see a clear active leader at this present time.
I'm well, I'm very involved in American Water Works Association, and their government affairs office, I think, does a very good job of tracking these, and their communications department. But I don't know that that really gets disseminated beyond the water industry like it could.
Yeah.
Um, it's difficult. The news likes a bad story, not a good one. So it's difficult to be the ones they call to get that information and get that out there. But we um, and Isle Utilities, does a great job too, kind of getting that information out there. It's just we are not the water industry has not been the most agile in adjusting to the communication trends,
Mhm.
and I include myself in that. But it's always been traditional that when a problem arose, you developed your solution and then you went to the public. Well, the public is finding out about the problem before you have your solution. So you've got to get out there sooner. And that's just something that we, across the board have to learn, get comfortable with.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. If you think more broadly, if we just kind of go away from this topic and we just think about how uh, society, how folks are just really changing their expectations. If you think of yourself, as a consumer, we really can't survive without our phones. Everything's on an app. We order everything online. We, you know, we want instantaneous results. We want to be able to provide feedback instantaneously. You know, if we look at that sort of consumer behavior that is really changing across all generations, it's going to be really interesting to see how that really, it puts pressure on us as an industry, the water industry, to adapt and really do better storytelling, you know, really look at customer service, and catch up, right, to how society's changing. I think it's going to be a really interesting number of years, and we're in an interesting pivoting period. And the topic of CECs and PFAS is just one of many that, you know, is an opportunity, I think, for us to evolve more quickly. So, well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this. This is really insightful and interesting, and we'll definitely want to continue the conversation and continue to see how you, as your team at Suez and your leadership, how you all continue to tackle these challenges. So thanks for your time, Carol.